Thank you so much, Professor Ellis, for the lovely introduction. I appreciate being here so much. I wanted to thank the Center for Culture and Technology for having me here today, all the way from Phoenix, Arizona. So forgive me if I seem really sleepy mid-talk. My body's definitely figuring this out still. I just arrived yesterday. But I also want to thank Dr. Crystal Abedin for inviting me, and Tam Oliver, and also Linda for helping to set everything up today. I do really appreciate it. So again, thank you for the warm introduction to my bio. I was planning to tell you guys why in the world I'd be here anyways. And you can see up top, I have several logos and this extraordinarily lovely mural. This would essentially be the sponsored sticky on my ad if this was Instagram. So these are all of the several projects that help to fund my position. And in the United States, a research assistant professor position is essentially a funded research slot within a center. And so I work in the Office of Gender-Based Violence, and I work with several researchers who do intimate partner violence work. And for the past 3 years, I've helped to run an AmeriCorps program, and I'm going to actually go into quite a bit of detail about the AmeriCorps program later on in the presentation. And this extraordinarily lovely mural is at Chicana por la Casa. It's one of the nonprofits that we collaborate with in the community to bring online interventions to people experiencing domestic violence. So I heard that social workers had caught wind that there was a talk. Do we have any social workers who had shown up today? All right, I'll take it. So just a brief caveat about social work. I love to tell people that we are the engineers of the social sciences. We like to go out and really tinker in people's day-to-day life and try and find ways to empower them and make their lives better. And we really, we have a very specific code of ethics and a way of handling issues that like is near and dear to my heart, and all of my degrees are in social work. So I'm very appreciative that you came today, and I think that what you'll see is that social workers have always been at the front lines figuring out social problems and what to do. So today I'm going to be talking about technology-based abuse, and I'm going to just give you a really brief outline of my talk before we get going, only because I'm going to give an extraordinarily in-depth theoretical explanation of specific concepts around intimate partner violence, and I wanted to give you a heads up now because this is such a common social problem. If you have personal needs, if this content feels heavy or if it brings up something personally for you, I just want to encourage you to take care of yourself, leave the room if you need to. By all means, if there's something that you want to contribute to the conversation and bring that into the discussion, I think that's always much more enriching, but it is such a common social issue that if it touches you personally, please don't feel as though it's rude to get up and leave if needed. We will talk in depth about the theories, and then before we start talking about the actual study that I'm going to present to you, I'll give you actually a bit of hope. So on the one hand, I do look at social issues and problems around technology-based abuse, but I also study interventions. And so I'm going to introduce you to the intervention study that gave me the data that is specific to technology-based abuse. So I'll give you just a small ray of hope before I return back to abuse before the end of the talk. And again, since this is a smaller group, I think that things I've been told are informal, which is very good for me. By all means, if you have a question, feel free to stop. We can have a conversation as things are going, or we can wait until the end. So I'll leave that up to you. All right, let's begin. So this is the premise, the very beginning, the broadest brushstroke I can paint for you about the importance of understanding the history and what we know about violence thus far. So empirically, we have evidence. We know that the type of violence that men perpetuate is more dangerous, it has more impacts, and it's more common than the type of violence that women perpetuate. So we're going to just start with this very simple premise. We cannot ignore that the types of violence perpetuated are different when there's elements of sexism involved. So here, this is a problem unique to the United States because of our socio-political climate, but these are mass shooters that have all happened since 2017. And what you'll see is what these mass shooters all have in common is not age, race, socioeconomic status. It's not their background. All of these shooters actually had a history of perpetrating intimate partner violence with their former partner. And 54% of the mass shootings in the US, there is an intimate partner present, or there's an element of IPV when the incident happens. So oftentimes someone is actually acting out in violence towards their partner, and there's just other casualties involved, bystanders who end up, unfortunately experiencing the violence just as well. So I think that this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that the commonality between these shooters is not necessarily any sort of history or background personal to them, but when we look at the cause, they did all have an internalized sexism and a history of perpetrating violence with the women in their lives. So within the intimate partner violence world, or in research that is about gender-based abuse, there are essentially two different camps. So there's a feminist camp and what people would consider a family violence camp. And essentially, we wouldn't necessarily even have a research or a field or a place to talk about intimate partner violence if it hadn't been for the grassroots activisms that had happened during the 60s and 70s. So essentially, because of the grassroots organization by feminists, we actually have redefined what egalitarian relationships are supposed to look like to begin with. At the same time that this was emerging, there were people who began researching the issue, and there was a long-standing contested debate about the causality of intimate partner violence. So people who frame it as gender-based violence, they would essentially say that it is because of patriarchy, it's because of the amount of privilege afforded to men and the social systems and structures that reinforce the violent behaviors that actually perpetuates and lets this violence happen in our communities. Whereas people who study, or people who are using the family violence perspective would essentially say that it was someone's background. So in the beginning, these people were essentially, they were looking at the behaviors and saying that there's a broken relationship here, not necessarily a broken person, and there's a conflict because of the communication and pattern between the two. And so if we're going to actually do anything to intervene or to help, we need to essentially look at both people. So some people might call this bidirectional violence. And within the feminist camp, they really do focus on and look at the impacts of violence, and within the family violence camp, they're looking at the behaviors in a way where they're essentially counting or looking at the exchange between the two. To this day, essentially, the majority of these arguments have been settled at this point. So at this point in time, we actually have pretty much rounded agreement that men have an impact that's different than women, and they're much more likely to perpetuate physical violence and sexual violence. But there is still some dispute about what you define as violence, when and how you calculate violence, and what the level of accountability is with the partner. So the specific theoretical framework that I'm coming from is gender-based violence, and I'll talk more in depth, and especially as we look at Johnson's typologies later on in the presentation, I'll talk about it's not just a matter of having a theoretical point of view because it's important for my sense of self or my worldview. It's really important because it actually helps us to identify and recognize the dangerousness within relationships and to identify long-standing patterns. So if we're going to intervene and do anything to help people to prevent violence, we have to be really honest about the context and the overall history of the violence in the relationship. So this is the definition from the World Health Organization. And so I'm just going to briefly look at this with you. So there's acts of physical violence, sexual violence, emotional and psychological abuse, and controlling behaviors. And this very last element, or this last component, is really key for understanding the gender-based violence perspective. So essentially, it's not conflict that becomes violent isn't the same thing as a long-standing abusive relationship, and the controlling behaviors that are present are a strong indicator of the danger that someone might be experiencing down the road. There is one thing that is missing from this. So if we were to use the Center for Disease Control's definition, they actually include stalking as well. So stalking is actually an extraordinarily important thing to pay attention to with intimate partner violence, because we know that the danger increases when a woman is trying to leave the relationship. I should also give you the caveat. I have a tendency to use women and men and talk about this. Certainly, we know that there are issues of abuse within LGBTQI relationships. However, because I'm going to be talking to you very specifically about the violence that's perpetuated and at its most dangerous level and most commonly from heterosexual males, I will talk about it from that standpoint more specifically throughout the talk. This is the Duluth model. So you can go into essentially any domestic violence program, any shelter across the country in the United States, and you're going to run into the Duluth model. And this came out early, like I believe in the early 90s. And what you see here in the very center of the power and control wheel is that these characteristics of abuse develop and create a web. So it's not just as though somebody who is in an abusive relationship experiences one thing, but they experience several forms of abuse from their partner. And what's, again, important to emphasize here is that the abuser is able and acts a sense of control within the relationship by using violence and threatening violence, and very specifically threatening physical and sexual violence. So an abuser might never hit his partner, not one time, but he might pull a gun on her once and repeatedly make threats to kill her. And that kind of control, that type of violence, is going to be a stronger indicator for everybody in the situation's danger than perhaps a different form of violence one time without that same element of coercive control. So here is just a brief, very early stage theoretical model where if we're going to look at the power and control wheel and start to apply issues of technology-based abuse, essentially what we're looking for is, does the technology actually offer people a way to employ that coercive control within their relationship more so than if they didn't have access to the technology? So are they able to give threats more willingly? Can they say something to their partner more consistently? Can they disrupt or undermine their partner's ability or willingness to leave the relationship by just essentially wearing them down time and time again? Because that coercive control really does come from trying to remove the agency for that individual through several acts over a longer period of time. So what does technology do that essentially inhibits, empowers, emboldens, assists abusers? The prevalence of intimate partner violence. There's 28.8% of women in the US are victims of IPV in their lifetime. It's about 11 million women and 5 million men report some incident of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. For college students, 30% of the women ages 18 to 24 were killed by an intimate partner. So this can and will impact the students in your classroom potentially. It's something to pay attention to. And then globally, and I want to be very careful about this, globally we know that this is not just an issue within one culture, one country, one context. Globally, gender-based violence shows up across the board. So 33% of all of the homicides across the globe are perpetrated by an intimate partner. And we also know that if you look at global statistics, so again, if you're looking at country reports in different cultural contexts, women experience more injury, more severe injury, and they're more likely to experience sexual violence. So the type of violence that is sustained by women is just empirically different than the type of violence that men experience. Okay, this is where I got more facts for you. I got to hit you with all the facts. I want to make sure you're on board that this is a very serious social problem. So we have health and mental health issues. So 48% of women who had experiences of IPV report depression, whereas the general population is closer to 17%. If you look at very specific behaviors within the relationship, that can actually be a precursor or essentially a portend harm down the road. So for instance, if my partner stalks me, I'm more likely down the road to report PTSD. So depending on how the abuse unfolds, it can have longer term impacts. And because stalking is such an important element of the talk today, I want you to keep that in mind as well. We know that IPV is related to, let's see, there's so many health issues. Higher rates of HIV. It's related to more instances of using alcohol, seizures, chronic pain, migraines, and other traumas essentially will lead to like long-term strain and stress on the body. And specifically, even just one incident can cause serious brain injury as well. And then lastly, we know that there's economic impacts born. So women who end up engaged with the criminal justice system or missing work, on average, are going to lose about $105,000 US dollars per year, and men, it's closer to 23. So suffice it to say, intimate partner violence is something that has a significant impact on someone's life. It's not something to be taken lightly, and we know that it's extraordinarily disruptive, not just for the individuals, but the communities who are experiencing these issues. So, at this point, because I've talked about this at such great length and talked about the common, or how common and how prevalent intimate partner violence is, I think a common question or something that people might start to feel is, isn't this a sign or an indicator that violence is a part of all relationships? Doesn't that mean that perhaps if it's 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men, doesn't that mean just at some point during the maturation of your own personal emotional development growth or during the course of the early stages of your relationship, isn't violence just expected to happen? And that's actually something that's most important to understand the difference between what is the most dangerous forms of violence and intimate terrorism, coercive control, and what is just relationship conflict. So, fortunately for you, the audio is not working, so I'm not going to make you listen to this very somber call, but this is Laura McCluskey. She was murdered last year by her boyfriend at the University of Utah on campus. So essentially, she broke up with him because she found out that he had lied about his age and that he was a registered sex offender. When she found out, and there was no history of abuse within the relationship, it was only when she broke up with him. So once she broke up with him, he started to threaten her with extortion, saying essentially, if you don't do this, if you don't pay me $1,000, I'm going to release your intimate photos. If you don't, he was using fake profiles, so essentially saying like, so-and-so killed himself and it's your fault. And he showed up at her apartment one time, physically. So she called the campus police, filed a police report, the call that we're going to skip for today. You can hear her talking to the local precinct about what was happening. And what's so distressing about listening to this call is you can tell that she's just trying her best to get someone to pay attention to what's going on. But her voice isn't strained, she's not crying, she's not weeping, she knows there's something wrong, but she's a very polite young woman. She's being polite to the officer, but you can also tell by the end of the call there is a sense of agitation, like, why do I need a case number? Like, she just wants someone to really pay attention to this person. And the person was on parole. He very easily could have been intervened on. Like, this would have been the scenario in which there would have been the easiest repercussions or ways to control the potential perpetrator, but nobody believed her that there was dangerousness. And the University Police unfortunately made a statement saying, well, she never said she was afraid for her life. And I mean, certainly there's troubles and problems with us thinking that victims have to be the ones to sense or know when there's danger. But more importantly, what I want to bring to your attention was there's really specific forms of technology-based abuse that should have been and could have helped people to understand. So this threat of extortion, this idea that he was trying to essentially sexually punish her or humiliate her by releasing her intimate photos, to me, that really does speak to someone being very dangerous, right? This isn't just somebody who's this is somebody who's trying to take action to gain control of the partner again, and that coercive element should have been a red flag for people in the system. So next I'm going to talk to you about Michael Johnson's typologies, and I get really gung-ho and enthused about theory, so I'm going to try not to have this drag on for too long, but I do think that Michael Johnson did a fantastic job of essentially taking what was this 30 years of empirical evidence and saying, I know what's going on here. He looked at these different forms of violence and came up with the typologies to explain what does it mean when we have 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, and what does it mean when we have these instances in which intimate partner homicide is happening, for instance. Like, how can we tell the difference between these forms of violence? So essentially what he's saying is it has a lot to do, again, with coercive control. So intimate terrorism, that's the form that I've been talking about repeatedly over and over, this element of coercive control. Violent resistance. Now this is important. So the orange block indicates that this person is violent. This yellow arrow is for coercive control. So you see here that there's actually only one partner enacting any coercive control with the other. So essentially we would assume the man is trying to control the woman in the relationship. Situational couples violence, there is no coercive control element. So both partners have acted out violently at some point in the relationship. Perhaps they had a conflict that turned violent, but there was no element or history of coercive control between the two. And then this last, I'm actually not even going to go into depth about this, because essentially Johnson's, in his book, he talks about this being just theoretical. So I think that it's something that we can and should potentially pay attention to in the future, but as of right now, it's all just theory. And especially as our culture's world evolves and changes, it's even more important that we understand the elements of coercive control, because perhaps things will shift and change as people's gender becomes more fluid. Like, how will we look for signs of danger if it's not just about identifying men as more dangerous, but recognizing and knowing, well, what were the tactics that men have been using that put them in a position of power within the relationship? So intimate terrorism, there's 4 key elements for us to understand. And again, this is one particular partner enacting coercive control and using violence. There's threats and intimidation, monitoring, undermining the will to resist, and undermining the ability to resist. So essentially what they're doing is they're setting up a social dynamic or a system with their partner where repeatedly they're making it difficult for the partner to leave, or they make it difficult for the partner to have a sense of agency. And they do this with repeated threats of violence or acts of violence that they remind their partner about. So with these examples, I'll give you a moment to read, but I just want you to look at how in this very first example we see that essentially people who are experiencing this attempt to gain control in the relationship, it's a common response to try to please the partner or change in order to remove the violence. But what we end up seeing is that over and over again, because the violence was never based off of any emotional, healthy, realistic standard for the partner, there's nothing that they can do. So it's that sort of that old colloquialism, like you feel like you're walking on eggshells, right? So I think that a lot of the violence is traumatic, but it's actually the threat or the idea of having to sort of keep your guard up at all times is what wears on survivors. And then in the second example, we can see how, again, people are acting out in instances when the partner is trying to leave. So if somebody's trying to leave the relationship, they're regaining control by exploiting the type of information they had access to at a time when they were together. So next is the violent resistance. And this typology isn't necessarily a totally new couple. What this is the question is, what does it look like when women enact violence against men? And this is a particularly interesting and important question because I don't know how invested or interested you guys are in specific psychometric scales, but let me just tell you a bit about some. So the danger assessment is a very specific 20-item scale that looks at not only severity of abuse, but it also predicts the likelihood of homicide. So that's Jackie Campbell's work, and she did that it was actually a really lovely study. So the way that she did it was she went to 11 different cities and she interviewed by proxy, and she also interviewed women in shelter. So she was essentially interviewing sisters, close friends, women who would have known the person who's experiencing the abuse, and she came up with all of these different items to essentially indicate, okay, so here's someone who experiences severe abuse, but here's someone who experiences severe abuse and then gets killed. And that's how she made that differentiation. And again, she would have been a gender-based violence researcher. If you look at things like the conflict tactics scale, it's much more likely just to be counting behaviors. So essentially they're saying, well, the woman is violent too. She threw a plate at him when she was mad. Or I'll show you an example here in a minute of what violent resistance can look like. It's true, women act out in violence. But what this does is it shows us that women are complex, emotional human beings that have a very rational response. They're just trying to gain a sense of control within their lives as well. It's not an act of violence because they want to hurt someone per se, they just want to take back the control that they feel that they're losing. So if you look at the conflict tactics scale, people will often say, if I'm seeing this, it looks like men and women are equally violent, because if you just count it up, they might show the same number of incidences, but what matters most is that we weight those incidents. So we say, true, her throwing a plate was an act of violence, but it's not the same act of violence as when you put a gun to her head while she's asleep, right? That's a different form of violence. We have to be really thoughtful and careful about how we weight those items. So these are specific forms of violent resistance, and my point here is that there are people within the context of the relationship where the partner is trying to gain coercive control and the individual acts out to get that control back. So what does it look like when women are being violent towards men? And there was one study done very, very early on by a psychologist that said essentially that there was codependency issues, and that became a really popular narrative. But then a follow-up study very shortly after, so this would have been in the 80s, done with 50 different shelters in Texas, in the United States, it showed that violent resistance is by far the norm. So people who are experiencing this level of violence are much more likely, it's much more common that the woman enacts some form of violence back, whether it's an act of defense, it's the act of leaving, or it's just essentially, a built-up frustration. It is the norm that the woman acts out in defense of herself. And then the last thing I want to point out to you or talk to you about with these typologies is the situational violence. So essentially, what this says is that the reason why we have such high rates is there are instances in which violence does happen within a relationship, but there is no element of coercive control. So when you look at population level data, or you're looking at the national counts, that's why you get such high numbers. Is we do know that people experience violence, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're even unhappy in their relationship. There's even studies to show that they go on to have a very fine long-term marriage together. However, I think it's extraordinarily important that we notice that the four themes that Johnson identified within the literature when you look at these population level studies is that they all have a gendered element, right? So there's relationship status, money matters, children, and division of labor. So again, if people have internalized sexist attitudes, or as people are ironing out the equality within their own personal relationships, it is quite literally dangerous for them. It can end up in a state of violence. So the question for us becomes, how does our current online social landscape give an abusive intimate partner more opportunity for coercive power? And I think it's extraordinarily important that we understand the difference between coercive power and indicators of dangerousness versus just conflict. So relational conflict can and will happen. People might become aggressive with one another, but it doesn't necessarily equate that same coercive control or intimate terrorism. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of all of the studies that have tried to tackle technology-based abuse in the last 10 years, but it's a start. And what I'll show you is these green studies here, these are conceptual papers that try and make sense of what the experience of technology-based abuse is like. And then the blue boxes, that's quantitative studies, and pink is qualitative. And the top row, these are all studies that would have been done with college-aged students. So these are all studies, and some of them actually use methodologies like mixing in college students and Facebook users, but they're all done with what you might think of as population level. So if we're thinking of that same pattern within the literature, these are all people who would have been representative of quote-unquote normal relationships. And then you see here that studies that were done within the context of domestic violence shelters and programs, court records, or where you interview survivors directly, the primary majority of these studies were actually qualitative, and they've taken much longer to build up in the literature. So I'll just say that this is probably not even half. It's like there's so many studies on college students and what technology-based abuse looks like, but it's really quite different. So what I wanted to tell you about is, and I'll bear up to my own sins, but so Finn in 2004, he studied online harassment and did like a true random sampling where he stood outside the Memorial Union handing out surveys to every fourth person. And it was about 17 to 21% of the students in that study experienced some type of harassment. And then in 2005, Alex and Burgess came out and they were talking specifically about cyberstalking, and they actually gave their students a vignette of cyberstalking and asked them. And in this instance, it was quite extreme. It was the first prosecuted case of cyberstalking in California, and so the person had what they would have doxed them, they posted revenge porn, and they actually did physically show up at the house, and it was only about 70% of the students actually identified as stalking. So they were essentially making the point that like people have a tendency to minimize and or reduce, like people are less likely to see these as serious or significant issues, partly because they're online, and this was the 2005. But they also made a claim, so they asked their students just like smattering of questions about like, well, do you ever follow your ex online? And this is the first time you see this pattern emerge. Women report more stalking than boys do. When you look at, or I should say men, women and men, college-age students, the women have a tendency to report higher rates of cyberstalking, and this happens repeatedly. So we see it in the Alexi study, we see it in the Bennett study, we see it in Tokunaga, but over and over again, people start to say, well, it looks like college girls are really dangerous, like we've got to be extraordinarily careful. And one of the, what I'm trying to bring to your attention is that Johnson wasn't studying technology-based abuse at all, but we see a similar pattern in the literature where people start to think of bidirectional violence or just counting instances is going to give us some sense of what's happening or give us a sense of, it's going to indicate or tell us what to do about keeping people safe, but if we're not careful, we'll start counting and stop contextualizing the behaviors. Also, this is just a fun walk through all of the different ways people have addressed this or talked about it. So there's online harassment, cyberstalking, cyber abuse and aggression, electronic victimization, social surveillance, which I have to say is actually my favorite. So Tokunaga actually did start to differentiate the fact that people are living in such a different, and again, this is 2011, so he says people are living in such a different social landscape now, but it's actually just a part of our norm, or it's just what we do, is we check up on one another. And so he started to tease out social surveillance versus monitoring within the context of an intimate relationship. And then Rains and Hansen used a criminal justice theory and said that there were criminal elements to cyberstalking. So I think that the theoretical background that you're going to draw from is going to, inform the way that the data becomes interpreted. And then I did a study in 2012 where I actually replicated Finn's very first survey. And what I found was 44% of college students reported some experience or instance of harassment. And it made for a great study. It showed like, oh my gosh, look at how this social issue is rising. But I think that really, I tried to be extraordinarily careful that we didn't blame technology or act as though kids within the last 10 years have become just warped and totally different, much more violent. And interestingly enough, in that study, so it was a logistic regression model, so it's like, did experience harassment, didn't experience harassment, stacked up variables, right? And when I stacked up the variables, one of the things that was actually predictive of less reports of harassment. So I don't want to say it was a protective factor, but if you reported that you did send a sexed message, you were less likely to experience harassment. And this was one of the very first things I'd ever done as a PhD student, and my advisor was like, oh, whoops, you did something wrong. You need to go see the statistician. So I was like, oh, whoops, sorry. First logistic regression, let me go down and see the statistician on the 5th floor. So he and I sat down and we ran the model 4 or 5 more times, and it was true. It was still true that if you reported sending a sex message, you were less likely to report having experienced harassment. And the conclusion I came to is developmentally, it's appropriate for you to start experimenting and trying new things with your boundaries, right? You're in college now, you might have an intimate partner that you feel very safe with. It's a normal thing. And in 2010, sexting was actually like, it was all the rage for panic at that time too. So it was pretty controversial and fun when I would tell people this. They were really frazzled by it. I did do a follow-up study with that same data in 2015, where we examined and looked very specifically at the relationship context. And what we saw was that the relationship context mediated fear. So if you are experiencing harassment and the harassment is coming from your intimate partner, you're experiencing more fear, you have more consequences. So again, we see that it's actually the context of the abuse is what matters, not necessarily that one-off incident or what happened one time, but rather the course and history of the relationship. So if we look at these shelter studies, these are wildly different disciplines. We have people who are from criminal justice, we have computer science people, and we have, I think we have anthropologists up here as well. And then these are just practitioners, not just, but these are people in the community who specifically work as advocates nationally in the US. And within the shelter studies, over and over again, they talk about stalking because when women showed up to the shelters and programs, stalking was a huge issue. Like, what are we going to do to actually help a woman leave if there's no way for her to actually cut off ties with that abuser? So repeatedly, stalking became the theme within these qualitative interviews. What else do I want to say about this? We do also see an evolution of terms. So probably my favorite towards the end, I've been calling it technology-based abuse. Dragowitz, Harris, Woodlock, and Salter, Easton, Lynch, Campbell, Leach, and Milne, they all call this technology-facilitated coercive control. So again, people who are interviewing or looking at shelter samples are more likely to pick up on those coercive elements. So all of this is just to say, Johnson took 30 years of intimate partner violence studies and said, it's not as though people's experiences of violence are, the violence that people are experiencing has to do with where we draw our data from and then how we analyze that data long term. And what I'm trying to point out to you here is that it looks as though we might be having that same pattern emerge or that same mistake where people start to count out a behavior. Well, if you visit someone's Facebook page 100 times, you're a cyberstalker, right? But maybe it's more complex. Maybe what's more important is if you're willing to release someone's nudes to punish them. That's the behavior we need to be paying attention to, and we should be weighting differently. I'm going to go through a few more examples of technology-based abuse, then we'll talk really specifically about my study as well. But here you'll see that, and this is a study done here with researchers in Australia, oftentimes the harassment is about undermining the will to resist. So calling someone 50 times in a day, texting them 70 times, that's just about disrupting them. It's making it difficult for them to leave. Eventually they might just want to come back because it actually does give them more control of their life if they're in proximity to their abuser. And then this is clear back in 2005, so I do think that that's really quite lovely. The information superhighway world we live in is a two-edged sword for survivors. The whole goal of escaping an abuser is to do just that, escape. After one has gone through the trauma of leaving, often with small children in tow, how horrifying is it to wake up to the reality that you can't escape at all? The internet doesn't hide anyone. So survivors have known for a long time what the dangers are of having constant social presence and what that can do to disrupt their ability to move on and have a new life. So this is a study, this would have been a population level study, but essentially it's the norm for people to do something to try and gain control by changing their online social landscape, right? So they're going to change their password, they're going to change their accounts. But we are asking victims to be more responsible for the perpetrator's behavior still at this time. And then this is a forthcoming study, and this quote is a little confusing, so I just want to give you context, but essentially the child of the abuser was savvy enough to notice that her father had been following them and stalking them, and so she had written down her father's password, or she figured it out, and so the child would log into her father's Facebook, and she would make sure that he wasn't going to show up.
because several of the mutual friends that they had on Facebook wouldn't unfriend him, and so he did keep showing up. So like it would have been like their relatives, the uncle and the grandfather, they're still friends with the abuser, and this young girl that was like, okay, well, we can see what he's going to do if we log in and watch him. So being careful not to categorize that person as a cyber stalker, but rather somebody who is being protective of her children, right? We really need to contextualize these behaviors. And then last, what about the situational couples violence? What does it mean when we have conflict show up? If you get into a text fight with your partner, I'm sure, no, I can speak for myself. I've said things that I regret to my partner at times that would have probably been categorized as aggressive even, and I wouldn't be proud of them. But is that the same thing as being in an abusive relationship? Well, it depends. If we catch it, if we capture it, if we leave these digital trails of all of our relationship context, what does that mean? So 12% of men have been targeted by a current or former romantic partner, and 12% of women. This is one of the first studies where I've seen people use a broad national survey, and it's only technology-based abuse, and I was just horrified because one of the headlines reads, men and women are experiencing the same level of abuse. But when you drill in and you look at these different items that they asked about, monitoring, harassment, online stalking, threatening to release intimate photos, if you start looking at it, sure, the 12% of men did experience maybe someone cyber stalking them, following them, but they didn't experience physical threats of violence, any sexual violence. They didn't experience the threat of having their intimate photos released. So we need to be extraordinarily careful. Let's make sure we contextualize all of the behaviors and not just count them. So, yes, please.
So in that case, what is the extent of violence that men experience now?
What is the extent? So I didn't write down the very specific items, but essentially men were more likely to report like their partner followed them or they had cyber stalking, and women were more likely to report like my partner threatened to release my nude photos, my partner threatened to physically harm me. So we see that the items that they are talking about are more related to that coercive control. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you'd like, I'd be happy to share the study too. Yeah, good question. So, and this is actually a really great way for us to completely and totally switch gears now, because I'm going to give you a ray of hope about online intervention, and then I'll talk to you about the very specific technology-based abuse work that I have for my study as well. So, this is that lovely mural. I tell you guys I run an AmeriCorps program. AmeriCorps is like the Peace Corps. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but the Peace Corps is essentially, what do I say about it? It's Americans, we think we can do good everywhere. It's really well-intentioned and sweet, but we do have students who are doing fantastic work in the community. So essentially, we send them out to internships where they implement our online intervention. We have about 40 shelters in the area in Phoenix, and so I think in total, I don't remember the exact amount of beds, but like our largest shelter holds 100 people. And we train the students on how to use this very specific online safety planning tool. And then they go to the shelters and they train the professionals that they work with on how to use this very specific online safety tool as well. Just a little humble brag about my students. We've handed out over $1 million in scholarships, which I'm quite proud of, and they've given over 70,000 hours of volunteer service in the community to help women in shelters and programs. This is them painting a really fantastic mural that you already saw. I really love that. And we've had over 100 students participate in the program in the last 5 years. So, also a caveat, the government doesn't necessarily know what I'm going to say today, nor do they agree with it, but they did fund the project. So thank you very much, the Corporation for National Community Service. You're some of my fantastic students now, but these are my own opinions and interpretations of this data. We had 22 different sites where we have the students assisting with data collection. So essentially all the students would get an iPad, they go out to the site, and they would not necessarily sit down and implement a survey, but they would just say, hey, do you want to try this app? And then the survivor, if they elected into it, they had 3 different options. So they could choose to try the app without being surveyed. So we made sure that the online safety tool was available to anyone who wanted to have access to it, whether or not they wanted to participate in research, or they could participate in just the baseline research. So a lot of our data comes from people who said, okay, I'll do a survey one time only, and then we have a longitudinal component as well. So we've had participants in the survey for the last 3 years, and I will say I spent about 20 minutes on the phone with one of our participants about 2 weeks ago, and it was, I have to tell you, I do qualitative research primarily, and I do quantitative as needed, and it was really quite heartwarming because this woman called, and I just don't think of quantitative as very connected, because it's just people answer. I don't like doing surveys, right? It doesn't feel connected to me. But this particular survivor called, and it was the most helpful thing to hear. She said that during the time in which she was leaving shelter, she felt very particularly lonely, and just having contact with people made her feel more positive. So getting reminders from the study and having some interaction made her feel like her story was important and she was helping other survivors. So I do think that if we're going to do quantitative research, this is the way to do it. We want to make sure that it's really immediately impactful, and it's always supports and appreciates the kind of information people are sharing with us. So My Plan is our very unique online safety planning tool that we promote out in the community. And it has 3 primary components. So you'll see here, this is your danger score. I talked previously about the danger assessment, the only scale that identifies intimate partner homicide risks and the level of abuse. So anyone who uses the app actually gets a score immediately. And then next they do an activity, this pairwise comparisons. So they have like a sliding bar. And you're picking between 2 complicated options, like my own personal privacy versus the safety of my children, the love I have for my partner versus my economic security. And what this does is it's supposed to reduce decisional conflict. And we've actually had 7 different randomized control trials and several iterations in which we've tested My Plan. And that is the one thing that seems to be very consistent. This is different countries, cultures. People's decisional conflict becomes reduced after doing the intervention. So walking through the steps, going through the activities, they feel more clarity about what their next step is and what they want to do. And then last, they get a tailored safety plan based off of the specifics that they've answered within the app. So if I say that I have kids, I'm going to get really specific strategies on how to keep my kids safe. If I say that I'm still living with my abuser, there's really specific strategies on what I do to stay safe in the home, especially if there's a violent incident escalating. It's available in Spanish, it's free to the public. I run the social media pages. If you go and like it today, I'll count how many people you have here. I'd be so appreciative. It's a great thing to promote with your students as well. There is an entire version that's specific to college-age students. So yeah, anyways, this is the intervention that the students were implementing in the community. So today I already mentioned to you the 3 different options to participate. The way that people are actually randomized in the trial is that the app, essentially every other time someone opens up the tool or someone goes in to use the app, you either get the dummy safety plan or you get the full-blown intervention where you go through all 3 components. Because I'm not going to report to you about the actual findings of the intervention, I'm just going to be very brief about those methods, but just point out that this is the way that we identify or talk about the intervention and control group. And we had a diverse range of participants in the study. So 58% had completed some college. Because we were working primarily with domestic violence shelters, almost none of the women had any form of income. All of the women who participated in the study, most of them had children. And again, we had about let's see, I have the numbers here. We have 38% white, 26% black, 12% Hispanic, 5%, 5% Hispanic, 1% American Indian, 50% Asian, and 33% multiracial. So this is indicative of the kind of women and people that you would see in shelter. And I would like to point out the Spanish version that we have available now wasn't available at the time, so that's why you actually see kind of a discrepancy considering we're in the Southwest. That population is actually a bit low. Previously, I talked to you about the typologies, Johnson's typologies. And again, intimate terrorism has those 4 key elements. So it's monitoring, threatening my partner, the ability to resist, and the will to resist. So these were the specific technology-based abuse questions that we asked about, and this is exploratory data. So we're just still testing and finding out what forms of technology-based abuse do impact or show up within these more severe cases where coercive control exists. And I would like to point out one of the major strengths of our study is this is the only quantitative research that's been done where there was actually validated abuse scales. So we actually do have scores from the danger assessment, CAS scale, and several descriptors of the type of abuse they were experiencing in addition to the technology-based abuse. The green items that I've highlighted, the colors aren't showing up quite as well as I'd hope, but these green items like threatened to kill my partner, spread rumors, tried to humiliate me online, shared private content online, these all indicate or show to us what someone would be doing online that would undermine the will to resist. And these yellow are really literally, they undermine someone's ability to resist. And again, I would like to reiterate that sexual violence and sexual coercion is a key element within these more serious and dangerous relationships, and it's much more common for women to experience. So of all of the women that we surveyed in our study, 33% experienced sexual coercion. So that was that item, has your partner essentially asked you to do something repeatedly online that they knew you didn't want to do? So where they pressured you. 75% experienced direct aggression, so threats about your physical safety, and 79 and other items that would undermine your ability to resist, and then 79% experienced digital monitoring and control. And these were just models that were looking for association, so these were just basic Pearson correlations, and what we found was that people who experienced physical abuse, they were 11.5 times more likely to also report experiencing monitoring, and 4.5 times, were likely to also report digital direct aggression. People who had a severe abuse score, so that would be an 18 or above on the danger assessment scale, they were 16.4 times more likely to experience monitoring and 5.9 times more likely to report experiencing that form of sexual coercion. And then last, and this, to me, I think that this is extraordinarily valuable, the lethality risk. So people who actually had indicators that there was a strong risk for intimate partner homicide were 4.6 times more likely to also report experiences of digital direct aggression. So what are the next steps? I think that I've built a pretty solid case to show you that technology not only is a factor, an element within abusive relationships, but it also employs more opportunity for people to be abusive if that context already exists in the relationship. One thing that you can do, there's a group of local researchers who just released a report specific to women who are accessing shelters here in Australia, and you see many of the same common themes, and I'm very grateful and pleased to report that they also talk about technology facilitated coercive control. Like they're the people who coined that term, and they're really onto that same curve, where if we're going to look at dangerousness, what we need to pay attention to is gendered elements, who's enacting uses of physical threat and sexual violence in order to control a partner long term. And these are specific recommendations from their report. So they want more training and education, affordability for device, and contract replacement. And this seems to be such an obvious fix, right? What would it be like if we could just give people a new phone when they enter shelter? Hopefully someone gives me lots of money one day to tell you, but we don't know yet. I think it could have a really big impact. Expansion of existing resources and regulation of abuse. And I do want to talk just really briefly about the more training and education. So because I was running that scholarship program for many years during my postdoc, I had a student who came into my office one day who was interested in joining the program, and she explained to me her own experience of abuse was what led her to the program in the first place. And her abuser had essentially, when she tried to leave, he had gotten into her iCloud account and was tinkering with several different things in her life, and he was popping up, he was using it for stalking purposes, and she ended up returning, and they had a violent incident escalate at one point, and she called the police, and when the police were coming over, if I remember correctly, he either hit his head on something purposefully or hit himself with the head, so he was bleeding when the police showed up. They ended up arresting her instead, and this is a common manipulative thing for abusers to do, is to make it look as though the woman is the perpetrator. And in Arizona, there is actually a rule that you have to arrest somebody. So they ended up arresting the woman, and they took her into psychiatric care. And when she was in psychiatric care, she had several mental health professionals, trained psychiatrists, psychologists interview her, and as she described very specifically the technology-based abuse, they ended up diagnosing her with paranoia and bipolar disorder, instead of believing her that the abuse was happening. So I'm sharing this anecdote specifically because people need to believe women and survivors. They are the experts in their own abusive situations, and the cornerstone, all of good domestic violence advocacy is built on this idea that we believe women, because often when we hear the stories, they sound outrageous. Abusers do extraordinary things in order to maintain this power and control. These are just my radical next steps. Like, if someone gave me a magic wand tomorrow, this is exactly what I want to see happen, or what I would want to have done. I think that we should be developing youth prevention programming that educates about internalized sexism, because there is a gendered element in all instances of violence, and also the most dangerous forms. We need to treat online harassment as hate speech, which is controversial in the US. People are really gung-ho about their free speech, and I get it, I really do. Like, I don't want to censor people, but is it really speech at the point in which you are doxing someone and sending them thousands of messages about how you're going to rape them. Is that speech? Is it speech? I have a lot of qualms about that. I don't believe it. I think we should ask social media companies to improve policies, or maybe this is the part you shouldn't tweet, or maybe we could sue them. Like perhaps some survivors could band together and sue social media companies for such what the poor job is that they have done thus far. I know in 2017, and I haven't checked since, but originally Facebook's policy was that if you have a nude released or an intimate photo and you want us to take it down, you have to submit a new photo to verify it. Oy, it's mind-blowingly bad policy, right? And it certainly undermines anything about believing women and survivors. So I think that we should treat Facebook and all of our social media platforms as the behavior modification tools that they are, and teach men and people who are keen to take ownership of women's bodies early on that that's violence. It is violence to release someone's intimate photo without their permission. And maybe even we regulate porn a little bit. I do feel like online pornography could actually be capturing what are many, many instances of violence that women just don't know about, or it's released without their consent. Someone might know a lot more about that. Please educate me, but I'm starting to feel suspicious of porn. It took me a long time to get there, but I'm nervous about it now. We should enhance statutes that show technology-based abuse as it relates to coercive control. So going back to Laura Mikulski's case, if the police had taken this threat of online extortion more seriously, they could have saved her life. If we train police, healthcare providers, and social workers to recognize signs of intimate partner abuse and dangerous abuse through these technology-based abuse behaviors, we might be able to prevent the most horrific outcomes